Thank you for that very warm introduction, and it is a great pleasure to be here. So a comment at the working group yesterday gave me a bit of thought about what I might talk about tonight. I have been working on things like water and sanitation and public protest and social activism and how governments and firms negotiate the environment. And I thought I could do a very serious presentation on war and the lack of infrastructure and environment, but I thought maybe we would think about some notions in environmental politics that will help us kind of think through more in a dialogue about issues that we don't think of as sort of immediately apparent as causes of human insecurity. So by insecurity, human insecurity, I simply mean a lack of well-being and a lack of health. So the kinds of things that threaten basically human livelihoods. And so I thought we might start by thinking about the ubiquitous plastic bottle, which we all obviously use every day in the Gulf. And the one thing that happens when you study something like environmental politics is that it is a dialogue between the fields of environmental science and social science. And some of the concepts that are used in environmental studies and environmental science we don't always use as well in political science. So I want to introduce some of those concepts, particularly one tonight, which is the notion of an ecological shadow. So we might say, what is that? It's very simply defined as environmental harm from resource production, consumption, and disposal that's displaced elsewhere. That displacement can be to other people, it can be to other places, it can be, of course, to other countries. The concept originally comes from discussions of the international harms that were distributed by things like the tropical timber trade, or, of course, to people who are not yet here or who are very young, that is, to future generations. And the intensity, that is, how intense an ecological shadow is from a given product or a given activity, reflects things that we can actually change. So it, of course, reflects public and government policy. It reflects corporate policy and practices. And it also represents or is the result of socio-cultural preferences and practices, all of which mean that a given ecological shadow is, of course, constantly changing over time as firms innovate, as governments change policies, and as societies change their practices. For environmental studies, this whole field of inquiry about ecological shadows has been very closely tied to research on environmental justice, which of course calls our attention to the unequal distribution of environmental benefits and harm for a given activity or a given product. And for political scientists, of course, we're interested in the kind of fundamental questions of how does an ecological shadow or an unjust outcome reflect injustices and unequal patterns of power, as well as this sort of inherent problem for environmental issues, which is that most decisions have to be taken across a multitude of different scales in order to have an impact. So often you have to have city governments, state governments, firms, financial institutions, and consumers involved to actually resolve many contemporary environmental problems. A sort of theme that I want to draw out tonight, because I'm going to talk specifically about garbage, the political economy of plastic, and climate change, is that the processes by which we create ecological shadows often include distancing ourselves from where these harms are displaced to. So in the American context, that distancing was often to poor communities, often, of course, to African American communities. It was often to distant places. So just as in the Middle East, we often think about the deserts as being either empty or wastelands, neither of which, of course, they are. In the American imagination, there's always enough wilderness that we can displace environmental harm elsewhere. And it's also closely related to ideas of inclusion and exclusion. That is, decision-making about the environment, if we're thinking in terms of these ecological shadows and their extensions, often reflects patterns of who is not at the table. And that includes both people, that is, they are not allowed to participate in decision-making, but it also includes non-humans, Because of course, one of the reasons that environmental problems persist is that those who are most affected, if they're another species or a kind of a place, have no voice in political and human institutions. I think that, I think it's kind of the basis of most environmental political studies. But I wanted to kind of take it a little more in depth and start thinking about how these issues play out in, of course, one of the more if you like, topics that's receiving media attention. So the topic of trash in Beirut. So as you all know, the You Stink campaign represents a failure of the Lebanese state and of its private contractor to handle solid waste after the main landfill here in Naama outside of Beirut was closed. And the interesting thing about starting to think about this movement is that it was closed precisely because the local villagers around it had been complaining for a decade since it opened in 1997-98 about the effects on local villages. So in a way, the central government responded because the villagers blockaded the road. So we have an instance where, of course, the trash from Beirut is being displaced onto a local community. The local community rejects it. And then we have, of course, the capital now piling up with trash. Now, the campaign itself, I think, is very interesting in the sense that it mimics many of the strategies, the tactics, and the discourses that we've seen not only in other environmental campaigns in the Middle East and North Africa, but also, of course, in the Arab uprisings more broadly. And in a way, this is simply a continuation of this moment, right? So it hasn't necessarily gone away. It's taking different forms. But this particular form, of course, echoes what we saw in Tunis and in Sana'a and in Cairo in the early days of these uprisings, where, of course, we monopolize the central squares. There's a nationalist discourse that's mobilized. But here, as in most environmental campaigns, it's actually tied to a critique of corruption within the state. So the campaigns that I've studied in Egypt, the thing that makes them sort of gain traction with the media, with broader publics, and eventually with decision makers is a couple things. And the first is that, can you make a claim that the state and business elites are directly responsible for an environmental problem? And that is indeed the claim, of course, that the Lebanese You Stink campaign has been making. They have come up with a number of creative slogans. The sort of early days of these mass protests always see an extraordinary verbal and visual creativity, which of course gets subsumed later on as things get more bitter. But the early slogans of this particular movement came up with such gems as, "Our waste should be recycled, our leaders thrown in the trash." Or, "If the state can't take out our trash, we have no state." So many of the sort of tactics, and I put this one in to show again that most of the uprisings early on, of course, not only had incredible creativity in how they framed their demands, but also in the variety of tactics. And we start to tend to forget this, that there was an extraordinary array, of course, of nonviolent civil disobedience at the outset of almost all the mass uprisings that, of course, the protesters here are extremely familiar with. So I want to come back to start thinking about this environmental campaign, to start thinking about what are the ecological shadows more generally cast by garbage, which is an extraordinary problem, not just in Lebanon, but throughout much of the poorer countries of the Middle East and North Africa. This is Cairo. This is not an exceptional site in Cairo. This is a quite normal site. So what we've seen in Lebanon, we have seen before in Egypt, and I just want to remind us of what some of the public health consequences are of inadequate distributions of solid waste, collection and disposal, of solid waste. So the first is, of course, contamination of surface water and groundwater. The second is the spread of disease and disease vectors, particularly in marginalized communities. And the last is actually, of course, from the open burning of refuse. So there was several studies that were done in the late 90s about air pollution in Cairo, which was a very big problem at the time. It still is, but it's actually gotten a little bit better. And the single largest contributor to air pollution was the burning of refuse. And what it was actually doing was creating very fine particles, very, very fine, that lodged in people's lungs. So the leading cause of respiratory illness and direct threats to human health was actually the burning of garbage. So Lebanon is, of course, not exceptional. For many states in the region, we do have this problem. And like many environmental issues, it's puzzling to us in some ways, because the solutions to this problem are very well known. And what's amazing is that they're not implemented even in countries like the United States. Europe is quite far ahead of us in implementing some of the ways that we can deal with the generation of solid waste and the ecological shadow that is cast by things like solid waste. Now, this slogan in English that's kind of known as the 4 Rs, reduce, reuse, recycle, and recover, was actually well known in the 1970s. It was taught to school children. We were all taught this is how you deal with solid waste. And yet, there's no systemic national, municipal, or state level policy that actually implements these things. So we have some recycling. It's not very effective. It's not very extensive. And actually, what we still do is we cast an ecological shadow over poorer communities and rural areas by landfills. So the dominant strategy of waste management in the United States remains simply putting it somewhere else. Well, in places like Lebanon, obviously, very small country, huge influx of refugees, civil war on the borders, this is not going to work very well. But it doesn't even work very well in places like Egypt. It's incredibly expensive to deal or to create modern landfills that are considered sort of up to kind of a set of international standards. It costs a fortune. So much better to actually start thinking about the well-known ways to reduce waste. Now, to the campaign's credit in Lebanon, the You Stink campaign, they, like actually some of the Egyptian health officials, have been saying it's actually relatively simple. If we separate at the source so that we have garbage that's organic, taken out from households and then collected separately, and then we have inorganic waste as a separate waste stream, that almost halves the waste streams in the Middle East, because so much of the waste is simply food that actually doesn't need to be going into landfills. Even if we did that, which was proposed in Cairo, is now currently proposed in Beirut, we're left with the problem of essentially non-organic materials. And this, of course, one of the biggest contributors is plastics. So I don't know if any of you like to dive, but if you do, one of the things that you'll see anywhere in the Red Sea, no matter how sort of undeveloped the terrestrial coastline is, it's very, very small, shredded, fine pieces of plastic that sort of come in and out as the sort of circulation patterns change in the Red Sea. Any of you who like to go to beaches will, of course, be very familiar with the plastic waste that's thrown up on most of the coastlines. This is a picture of an irrigation canal in Egypt, where the Ministry of Irrigation is actually frequently having to go out and dig out irrigation canals mechanically with large-scale diggers to try to remove the trash. In fact, it's well known that if you want to convert your agricultural land to urban uses, which a lot of people want to do because it actually is more remunerative, you simply go to the irrigation canal and fill it so many times with trash that the ministry gives up, you no longer have water, and then you can convert it to urban use. So we have a sort of, not only do we have an ecological shadow cast by landfills and the consumption and disposal of garbage, but we also have the ecological shadow of plastics, which then brings us to thinking more closely about the political economy of the Middle East and the Gulf in particular. So it turns out, of course, that the production of plastics relies on cheap fossil fuels. So if you think about how much of the global production of oil and gas goes into the production of plastic, it's about 4% as a basic input of feedstock, and it's about 4% for the energy used in the manufacture of plastics. So between 7 and 8% of the global production of oil and gas is used to make plastic products. What's kind of interesting, of course, is just like the fossil fuel economy as a whole, The creation of plastics doesn't even get widespread circulation into the global economy until after World War II. And here we have US firms, especially Monsanto, which had created plastics during the war and were looking for civilian markets. So essentially, they took advantage of the new consumer products and the new forms of agriculture being developed. So as we all know, what makes possible, if you like, the mass production of consumer food and cheap food is the fossil fuel revolution itself. So the production of artificial fertilizers, basically the fuel used for tractors and for diesel pumps and for transportation, all of that happens after oil becomes the sort of fuel of choice. So plastics accompany the fossil fuel revolution. They're a product of the fossil fuel revolution. And yet what's really interesting is that the impacts are not that well understood. So like so many other consumer items, particularly chemicals, the health impacts of plastics are really just beginning to be better studied. And the way they're being studied is by biomonitoring their accumulation in the tissues of individuals. So if we were participating in a research study in the United States, they would start monitoring which chemicals we had been exposed to. And it turns out that many of those are associated with the use of plastics. And that doesn't talk about, of course, the simple accumulations in landscapes, as we saw in the pictures earlier. So of course, plastics are an increasingly important part of the petrochemical centers, production in the Gulf countries. So there's been a very rapid and very lucrative expansion, of course, part of the economic diversification of the GCC. So the petrochemical sector for the GCC went from 3% of the global share of petrochemicals in 2000 to 6% in 2012, and it's actually on track to keep increasing very rapidly. The major exporters for the region as a whole for the Middle East are Iran and Saudi Arabia, partly because, of course, they have large feedstocks, which they're using at advantageous prices, and partly because they have an existing industrial infrastructure and transport structure, which is working very well for them. For thinking again about this kind of global ecological shadow, for petrochemical production in the Gulf, plastics are only 17.3%. A quarter goes to fertilizers. The rest is sort of basic and intermediate chemicals. So the Gulf is, if you like, part of this global production, not just, of course, of oil and gas and secondary industries, but for plastics as well. The other way in which the Gulf is involved in plastics in this kind of global network supply chain is actually not the direct domestic production, but of course by investing in other companies around the world that do this, both through joint ventures and also through acquisitions. So we've seen actually several firms, Western firms now, that also have significant investment by Abu Dhabi and by Saudi Arabia. So I think to just give us a sense that we are highly integrated into these markets, but that we're starting to only get a glimpse of what these ecological shadows are. So to summarize what they rely upon, the consumption of plastic and its kind of disposal at this point in time, they rely on the cheap feedstocks of fossil fuels. Since recycling rates are very, very low in most countries of the world, including the United States, and because the advent of biodegradable plastics is in its infancy, we need unrestricted places at this point to use for dumping and disposal. Most plastics, the very thing that makes this useful is also, of course, what makes it not biodegrade in any reasonable time frame. And the last thing, which brings us to, I wanted to talk a little bit about climate change and its effects for the Middle East, is that this sort of production and consumption relies on not taxing carbon. So that is using the global atmosphere as a dump for carbon dioxide from things like the production and use of fossil fuels and petrochemicals. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time, because I have worked a lot on things like adaptation in the Middle East and climate change. So I thought we can kind of wrap up the formal presentation part with thinking about climate change. Often the GCC, right, is told we have high consumption rates, somehow it bears responsibility because it's a fuel exporter. But of course, the countries that bear responsibility for climate change historically are those that industrialized first. That is the United States, Europe, Japan. However, through the impacts of climate change, the Middle East and North Africa is much more adversely affected than many other regions of the world. So we're kind of not necessarily responsible, and yet we are going to have to bear a lot of the costs. So this is just to show you a little bit of the trends that we already see. I think for most people who live here, trends towards higher temperatures and droughts, intense frequency of flooding, all those, quote, predicted impacts have already actually been evident. But this actually kind of shows us effects on rainfall. This is actually compiled by the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, which is the sort of US government agency responsible for atmospheric science. And they actually were monitoring essentially winter precipitation trends from rainfall stations across the region. And here, of course, what's interesting is not that there's variation for an annual basis or across decades. We all know that rainfall varies significantly. But what is sort of sad, if you like, or very concerning, is this decreased pattern of rainfall, that we still have intermittent episodes of intense rainfall, but that the overall trend is less rainfall for the region as a whole. This is Syria for the periods 2000 to 2010. And it shows basically the darker the color toward the red, the sort of less rain had been received from historic averages. And as you can see, of course, it was basically the sort of northeast and then the southwest that were most affected by the drought. And this is actually pulled by an observatory in Syria that was measuring drought. This is not from a US publication or agency. This is from a Syrian observatory in Damascus. And this was published before the uprising in 2011. So what I find very interesting as a political scientist is that the Syrian regime knew about the drought. They knew that it was actually happening. And yet the proactive measures to deal with the humanitarian consequences were lacking in the run-up to 2011, such that you had already a humanitarian crisis of internal displacement and migration out of these areas into provincial cities and into the capital city, which was very frankly unprecedented in modern Syrian history, this kind of very long, very intense drought. This shows you a kind of different impact, if you like, which is that, of course, in a drought, people tap groundwater. Agriculturalists, pastoralists, cities, all were basically either digging wells or digging them deeper or drawing down reservoirs in order to cope with the drought. This map uses satellite imagery to try to show essentially where groundwater levels, and this part I don't understand the technical parts of how satellites can measure groundwater aquifers, but what they say that it shows is, again, over time, the decrease in groundwater levels underneath. And this is, of course, the Tigris and Euphrates basin. So actually it's a little bit difficult to read. So this is basically showing us anomalies from historical averages and going sort of dropping quite precipitously in the course of a few years through the drought. So I wanted to just conclude by thinking, well, we have these ecological shadows. We can apply the idea of an ecological shadow to really any activity or any product. And then the question, of course, becomes what can we do to reduce the intensity of these shadows? So there's the kind of technocratic resource management approach, which is actually very important, but it's also limited. We can think about how to increase resource efficiency for any given process, for any given product. We can, of course, engage in demand management, much more so than we currently do. We can also try much more to increase mechanisms for environmental accounting. That is, how do we make hidden costs apparent to both consumers, but also ideally to governments? And how do we get environmental regulation and taxation that actually starts to incorporate these costs into production and consumption? But much more important, actually, for creating constituencies to do this is trying to address the kinds of exclusion that I talked about at the beginning. If essentially what globalized production and trade has meant is the displacement of environmental costs, if you can't include either rural communities or disadvantaged communities into those discussions, there's very little movement for change. It relies on technocrats, it relies on reformist officials, but that's not always enough. And in order to have sort of social engagement, you have to start dealing with patterns of economic and political exclusion. And that applies to the United States as well as to other countries. So I just wanted to spark a conversation about sort of ecological shadows and the costs of modern production and consumption, and think about sort of our inclusion as a region in a slightly different way. So thank you for your patience.
Please join me in thanking Jeannie for a very thoughtful
Thank you.
working.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.